The wind came from the north the way it always did in October, not as a visitor but as a landlord reminding the tenants of their place. It moved across the Wyoming Territory with a kind of institutional indifference, flattening the cured grasses, scattering the last of the season's dead leaves, carrying in its cold throat the first metallic hint of what was coming. The sky above the Hale homestead was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that looks beautiful in a painting and means nothing good to anyone who has to live beneath it. Margaret Hale knew that sky. She had learned to read it the way other women read almanacs. She was on her knees in the dirt 40 feet from the north wall of her cabin, and her hands were black to the wrist. The ground here was hard, a grudging mixture of clay and grit that resisted the spade with something close to personal offense, and she had been working since before the children woke. Around her, in what her neighbors would have called a pattern of baffling futility, and she would have called the beginning of a system, stood 11 young spruce saplings, their roots bound in squares of burlap she had cut from old grain sacks the week before. They were small. Against the scale of the Wyoming sky, they were almost invisible, the way a single spoken word is almost invisible against the silence of a large and empty room. She tamped the earth around the base of the nearest one, with both palms pressing firmly evenly, the way her father had shown her, and she did not look up when she heard the creak of wagon wheels on the frozen track that passed her claim. She knew the sound of Silas Mercer's rig. The left rear wheel had a particular complaint, a rhythmic squeal that came from a worn iron collar he had been meaning to replace for 2 seasons. She had heard it pass her property line a dozen times since George died, usually slowing, sometimes stopping, always the precursor to some form of advice she had not requested. She kept her hands in the dirt. Silas Mercer was a man who had arrived in Wyoming Territory in 1871 and had survived everything the land had tried to do to him, which he interpreted as proof that he understood the land, rather than proof that he had been lucky. He was broad through the shoulders, bearded in the manner of a man who had stopped thinking about his appearance sometime in the mid-1870s, and he carried his opinions the way he carried his axe, always within reach and ready to swing. He pulled his horse to a stop and sat for a long moment looking at Margaret and her saplings with the particular expression of a man watching someone make an error he has been waiting to correct. Ruth Mercer sat beside him on the wagon bench, her coat buttoned to the throat, her hands folded in her lap with a precision that suggested long practice at appearing composed while thinking unkind thoughts. Ruth was not a cruel woman in any deliberate sense. She simply found it easier to navigate the world from a position of comparative wisdom, and other people's difficulties provided useful coordinates. Margaret rose to her feet. She wiped the back of her wrist across her forehead and turned to face them, and there was nothing in her expression that invited the conversation that was coming. Silas climbed down from the wagon with the unhurried authority of a man who did not question whether his presence was welcome. He walked to the edge of her property, stopped where the grass met the turned earth, and looked at the arrangement of saplings with something between confusion and professional concern. His voice, when he spoke, had the carrying quality of a man accustomed to addressing people across distances of wind. "Mistress Hale." He used the formal address that was customary here, though it always carried a faint edge when directed at a woman managing alone. "What is it you're doing with all these little trees?" Margaret's answer came without hesitation, without apology, without the softening qualifications she might once have offered. "Planting them." The flatness of the response did not discourage him. "I can see that. What I mean to say is, with winter coming on, these little things aren't going to stop a blizzard from piling straight up against your door. You know what happens when snow banks against a cabin door? You know what happens to a woman and 2 small children who can't get their door open come morning." He paused for effect, though the effect he was aiming for was instruction, and the effect he was achieving was something Margaret Hale had no patience for. "You'll be sealed in, buried alive till the thaw." Ruth's voice floated down from the wagon bench, pitched at a frequency designed to carry. Poor woman, her hands must be frozen through. All that digging when she ought to be splitting wood for the stove. It was the tone of someone performing sympathy for an audience that consisted entirely of herself. Margaret looked at Silas steadily. There was a version of this moment where she explained to herself, where she offered the principle and the reasoning and the years of accumulated understanding that had led her to this specific arrangement of trees in this specific concentric pattern. She had tried once with George to explain how the smoke from their chimney told her things about the wind's behavior that his slat fence windbreak could not account for. He had listened with the patience of a man who loves someone whose ideas he cannot follow, and then he had rebuilt the slat fence after the first storm took it, and they had not spoken of it again. "It's not meant to stop the wind," she said. She kept her voice even informational, stripped of the defensiveness that would have given him something to argue against. "It's meant to lift it, and to place the snow where I want it rather than where the wind wants to put it." The silence that followed had a particular texture. Silas blinked once, twice, the way a man blinks when presented with a sentence that contains words he recognizes individually but cannot assemble into sense. His jaw shifted inside his beard. "Wind doesn't lift, Mistress Hale. Wind pushes. That's what wind does. It's going to push the snow straight into that little green fence of yours and fill up this whole space like a bowl, and you'll be sitting in the middle of it." He shook his head with the slow deliberateness of a man closing a book. "You're building your own tomb." He walked back to the wagon. Ruth offered one more look of compassionate concern, the kind that requires the other person to be suffering in order to function. Then the wheel complained its familiar complaint, and the rig moved on down the track, leaving behind it a cloud of dust and the absolute certainty of a man who had never been wrong because he had never examined the possibility. Margaret watched them go. She did not feel the anger that might have been useful here, something hot and propulsive. What she felt was quieter and more sustaining, a clear, cold sense of purpose that had been sharpening itself against other people's certainty for long enough that it no longer needed their approval to hold an edge. She turned back to her work. The homestead claim that George Hale had filed in the spring of 1882 was 160 acres of Wyoming Territory that looked generous on paper and merciless in person. The land was flat in the way that made some people feel free and other people feel exposed, a distinction that generally tracked with how much they had to fear. The cabin stood near the center of it, built of lodgepole pine with a sod roof that George had laid with his characteristic competence. The kind of man who could build a thing straight and solid without ever asking why it might need to be built differently. The walls were sound. The floor was packed earth covered with 2 rugs that Margaret had brought from her mother's house in Vermont, and sometimes in the evenings when the light came through the single west-facing window, at the right angle, the colors of those rugs were the only thing in the room that did not belong to Wyoming. George had died in April, a logging accident in the high country, the way men died in the high country with such regularity that there was almost a grammar to it, a predictable structure of cause and consequence, that everyone in the territory understood and no one knew how to prevent. A slope, a cable, a moment of miscalculation, and then the long ride back down the mountain with news that changed the shape of everything. Margaret had been hanging laundry when the foreman from the timber camp arrived. She had finished hanging the laundry before she went inside because the sheets needed to dry, and because she had already understood in the first seconds of seeing his face what the news was going to be, and there was nothing to be gained by leaving the laundry on the ground. What she had left was the claim the cabin 11 months of provisions, if she rationed carefully a milk cow in the lean-to, 2 children who were too young to fully understand what had happened, and old enough to feel its weight in every room of the house, and the knowledge her father had given her which she had carried for 22 years, like a compass she had never needed to use until now. Edmund Carr had been a forester in Vermont for the whole of his working life, employed by a timber concern in the Green Mountains that valued his knowledge of the land more than the lumber it produced, which was unusual enough in 1864 to mark him as a particular kind of man. He was quiet in the specific way of people who have spent most of their time in forests, where silence is not absence but fullness, a condition rich with information if you know how to receive it. He spoke to Margaret about trees the way other fathers spoke to their daughters about scripture, with the conviction that this was the knowledge that mattered, the kind that held when everything else gave way. She had been 10 years old the winter he took her into the balsam stand on the north face of Birch Hill during a January storm. The wind above the tree line was the kind that makes the body want to apologize for existing, a horizontal force that seemed to find personal offense in the fact of a small girl standing upright in it. Her eyes watered and her cheeks burned, and the snow was not falling, but flying, driven sideways in sheets of fine, hard crystals that stung every exposed inch of skin. She had been on the verge of asking to go back, which she almost never did because she understood instinctively that asking to go back was a kind of defeat her father would not have recognized. Then he put his hand on her shoulder and guided her down the slope and through the outer edge of the balsam stand and the world changed so completely and so immediately that she stopped walking and simply stood. The wind was gone, not diminished, not reduced to something manageable, gone. The air inside the stand of young balsams was utterly still, and the silence was the deep, particular silence of a place protected rather than simply empty. She could hear snow settling onto the branches above her, a sound like the softest breathing. She could feel, even through her coat, that the temperature inside this pocket of trees was several degrees warmer than the exposed hillside. The forest floor was covered in only a few inches of powder dry and undisturbed, while through the gaps in the outer branches, she could see the drift building on the open hillside, a hard sculpted form that grew as she watched it. Edmund Carr crouched beside her and pointed first to the drift outside and then to the powder at their feet. He was a man who understood that some lessons needed words, and some lessons the words only got in the way of. And he waited until he was sure she had seen both things before he spoke. "A solid wall is a fool's defense against the wind," he said. His voice was low and hurried, the voice of someone sharing something he considered essential. "The wind hits a solid wall and it gets angry. It presses harder, or it finds the edges and goes around and hits from the side instead. But a screen like this, 1,000 small branches, 1,000 needles, it doesn't stop the wind. It confuses it, breaks it apart into smaller and smaller currents until each one is too small to carry anything. A tired wind drops its load." He gestured toward the drift beyond the trees. "It built that. We didn't have to do anything but stand here." She had understood it completely in that moment and had never ununderstood it. That was the quality of her father's lessons. They settled into a place below the reach of doubt, where the things you know by experience live rather than the things you know by being told. She had watched it operate in the Vermont mountains for the rest of her childhood, had seen it confirmed in a dozen different forms, in the way snow accumulated behind stone walls, differently than behind board fences, in the way a windrow of bare-branched shrubs redirected a field's prevailing current as effectively as a planted stand of mature trees. The principle did not care about scale. It worked at 10 feet and it worked at 10 miles, and she had never had any reason to doubt it. She had had reason to keep it quiet. George Hale was not a man who dismissed his wife's opinions exactly. He was a man who held a clear and unexamined picture of the categories of knowledge and who belonged to each of them, and Margaret's observations about wind and snow and the behavior of air moving through obstacles fell outside the category he had assigned to her. When she had suggested in their second winter in Wyoming that his plan for a solid board fence windbreak on the north side of the cabin might produce a snow accumulation problem at the cabin wall, he had heard her out with patience and then built the fence. The first serious storm of that December took it apart in 4 hours. George had rebuilt it in January, made it heavier, made it taller, and the following winter it held for 6 weeks before the same storm pattern dismantled it again. She had not said anything then either. That kind of restraint had its own cost, paid in small daily increments, and she had been paying it for 5 years. Now George was in the ground on the eastern quarter of the claim under a wooden marker that Daniel had helped her plant, and no one was asking her to keep her understanding to herself anymore. The loneliness of that freedom was something she had not anticipated and had not yet found adequate language for. The work of gathering the saplings had begun in the last week of September, when the morning still held a thin warmth before the wind took it away. She had scouted the banks of Cottonwood Creek 2 miles east of the homestead in the early days after George's death in June, when she was still moving through the world in the mechanical way of someone whose mind has not yet caught up with her circumstances. She had noted the young evergreens growing thick in the damp, protected soil near the water, and she had followed the observation in the part of her mind where useful information waited, and she had returned to the task of surviving the remainder of that year. In September, with the first cold fronts moving through and the quality of the light beginning its seasonal shift toward the flat gray that preceded the hard months, she had made the calculation. The ground would be fully frozen by mid-November. She had 6 weeks, possibly 7. She needed between 80 and 100 trees, each harvested with its root ball intact, transported 2 miles on George's handcart, planted in the specific concentric arrangement she had worked out on a piece of scrap paper by candlelight one evening, while Daniel slept and Lily breathed the soft, unconscious breathing of a child who does not yet know there is anything to worry about. The first trip to Cottonwood Creek had been a revelation of how much she had underestimated the work. The handcart, which George had built with iron-rimmed wheels for durability, weighed considerably more than she had remembered when she loaded it with bald root masses and the dark creek bank soil she needed to supplement Wyoming's reluctant clay. The path back was not level. It rose and fell across two low ridges, and the cart's wheels found every stone and rut with a precision that suggested geological malice. Her back had begun to ache before she reached the first ridge, and she had stood at the top of it, breathing with her hands on her knees, looking at the pale distance between her and the small dark square of the cabin, and she had thought very clearly, this will take everything I have. Then she had picked up the handles and kept going. Daniel had started coming with her on the third trip. He was 7 years old, compact, and serious in the manner of children who have recently had something explained to them that adults normally conceal, and he had taken on a protective watchfulness toward his mother that was both touching and occasionally heartbreaking to witness. He could not manage the cart, but he could steady a sapling while she filled in the hole around its roots, and he could carry a bucket, and he could keep Lily from wandering into the creek. When the little girl's attention, which was considerable and unpredictable, fixed itself on something interesting in the water. Lily was 4. She approached the tree planting with the wholehearted enthusiasm she brought to most things, which meant she was helpful in brief, intense bursts, separated by episodes of complete distraction. She patted the dirt around the base of each tree with both small palms, mimicking her mother's focused pressure with total seriousness, and then would become absorbed in a pebble or a beetle, or the particular way light moved on the water, and Margaret would have to make a quiet decision about whether to retrieve her or let her go another 30 seconds before something got wet. What Margaret did not tell them, because they were too young for the exact dimensions of the risk and too important to be frightened unnecessarily, was that she was in a race. Not with winter exactly, though winter was the deadline. She was in a race with the moment when her neighbors would collectively determine that she could not manage the claim alone, that the children needed to be placed with relatives somewhere east, that the homestead should be relinquished. That moment would come if she let it come, and the way to prevent it was to still be standing in the spring, warm and intact and demonstrably capable, in a cabin that had come through the worst of what Wyoming could produce. The schematics she had drawn by candlelight were not guesswork. She had thought them through with the same care her father had applied to every decision that involved the way trees interacted with moving air, which was to say, carefully, precisely, and with full attention to the fact that the air always knew more about what it was doing than the person watching it. The outer ring of saplings, spaced 6 feet apart, was positioned 15 feet from the cabin walls. Their job was to intercept the leading edge of the wind and begin the process of fragmentation, breaking the main current into smaller threads that would begin to rise as they passed through the resistance of the branches. The inner ring, denser, spaced 4 feet apart, stood 10 feet from the walls and would catch the reduced fractured current, slowing it further at ground level, creating the still zone her father had stood her in on that Vermont hillside 2 decades ago. The snow would fall in that still zone, not drift, not pile, not build, the crushing banks against the door that Silas Mercer had described with such confident authority. It would settle gently a few inches of powder while the wind carried its heavier load upward and deposited it in the outer ring, where the trees would hold it, where it would accumulate and pack and ultimately become a wall. Not a wall she built. A wall the storm built for her using its own material, guided by the architecture of living wood. She could see it the way she could sometimes see the shape of a finished thing before she had begun it, with enough clarity that the work itself felt less like creation and more like revelation, the uncovering of something that had already existed in potential. What she could not fully see and what she did not allow herself to think about too directly was the other possibility. The one where the gaps between the saplings were the wrong size, or the spacing was wrong, or the soil was too alien to Vermont principles, or Wyoming's wind simply did not follow the rules she had learned in a different landscape 2,000 miles and a lifetime away. On a Tuesday in the second week of October, Vera Whitman came by. Vera was a widow of longer standing than Margaret, her husband Calvin, having died of a fever in the winter of 1879, and she had about her the quality of a person who has survived enough that survival no longer surprises her. She was perhaps 60, though the particular arithmetic of hard living made such estimates unreliable, and she carried herself with an economy of movement that suggested she had learned long ago not to spend energy that wasn't necessary. She had no wagon. She had walked the 2 miles from her claim with a covered dish balanced in the crook of one arm, and she set it on Margaret's table without ceremony or explanation, which was itself a kind of explanation. She stood in the doorway afterward and looked at the rings of saplings in their raw, disturbed earth. The outer ring half complete, the inner ring marked with stakes where the remaining trees would go, and she studied the arrangement for a long time without speaking. Margaret came to stand beside her, and they looked at it together, and the quality of Vera's silence was different from Silas Mercer's silence. In a way that Margaret recognized immediately, it was the silence of someone actually looking, rather than someone composing a verdict. "It's a curious pattern," Vera said finally, Margaret told her. Not the abbreviated self-protective version she had offered Silas, but the real account her father in the balsam stand, and the Vermont hillside, and the moment when the wind vanished, and the principle became something she had felt in her body rather than simply understood in her mind. She told her about the fragmentation of air currents in the physics of particulate suspension, and how a tired wind drops its load and what that load deposited in the right place could become. She used the words she had been using inside her own head for months, the precise technical words her father had taught her because Vera Whitman was listening in a way that could hold them. When she finished, Vera was quiet for another moment. Her eyes moved from the inner ring stakes to the outer ring trees to the open northern exposure where the worst of the Wyoming winter would come from. "Wind is a tricky thing," she said. Her voice carried no mockery and no enthusiasm, which was its own form of respect. "Maybe it can be tricked." Then she said something else. She said it the way people say things that matter to them, but that they have not necessarily planned to say, letting it arrive without announcement. She said that the previous winter, her son Edward's cabin, 12 miles to the north, and poorly sited on a rise with no natural shelter, had lost its roof in a December storm. Edward and his family had been unharmed. The cabin was repaired before the next storm, but she had spent 3 days not knowing whether her son was alive, because no one could travel in the aftermath of what that wind had done, and 3 days not knowing had a particular quality that she did not describe in any more detail than that because she did not need to. Margaret understood exactly. She understood it in the specific way of someone who had recently had their own version of 3 days not knowing and who was currently in the process of making sure it never happened to her children. She looked at Vera and she said, "If this works the way I believe it will, I'll show you everything I know about how I planted them. Every tree, every spacing, every detail of the soil preparation. Whatever Edward needs for next winter, I'll teach you to teach him." Vera nodded once, a slow, definitive movement that was not quite a smile but contained the same essential warmth. She walked back down the track toward her own claim, and Margaret watched her go and felt something she had not felt since George died, which was the specific lightness of being understood by at least one other person in the world. The work continued. She rose before light and worked until her hands stopped responding to her instructions with the reliability she required, then stopped. Made the children supper, told them a story, put them to bed, and drew on her paper by candlelight until the candle threatened to run out. On the 15th of October, she discovered that 2 of the inner ring saplings she had planted in the first week were failing, their needles yellowing from the base in a pattern that meant the roots had not taken. She pulled them the same day and replaced them, but the replacements went into the ground 2 weeks behind schedule in soil that was already noticeably colder, and she knew they were a risk. They were positioned at the northwest corner of the inner ring, the corner that faced directly into Wyoming's most common severe storm track, and losing them was not the same as losing 2 trees. Losing them was the same as leaving a gap in the most critical section of the entire system. She watered each replacement by hand for a week, hauling buckets from the well, which had begun to take on the cold metallic quality that meant the water table was responding to the dropping temperatures. She pressed the soil around their bases each morning with her palms, checking for the resilience that would indicate root activity, and each morning the soil told her nothing certain. She kept watering. She kept pressing. She added the richer creek bank soil she had in reserve, and she mixed it with the clay, and she worked it in around the roots with her fingers, and she did not allow herself to calculate the odds. The last sapling went into the ground on the 3rd of November, 94 trees in 2 concentric rings surrounding the cabin at distances of 10 and 15 feet respectively. The outer ring was complete, and the inner ring had the gap at the northwest that she had done everything she could to address. She stood back and looked at the arrangement in the gray afternoon light, And the feeling that came to her was not triumph. It was the feeling of someone who has committed fully to a decision and must now wait for the world to render its judgment. The sky above the Wyoming plains was the color of old pewter. The prairie grasses moved in long, fluid waves that looked almost gentle from a distance and felt if you were standing in them like the world was trying to redistribute you. A hawk circled high above the eastern quarter, riding something invisible tilting without effort in a current that was strong enough to carry it but too diffuse to be felt on the ground. She watched it for a moment. The hawk understood about air. It had no ideology about it, no theory, just the direct physical knowledge of something that would hold you if you understood which part of it to trust. Daniel came out of the cabin and stood beside her, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He was wearing the coat she had patched twice at the elbows and would need to replace before spring, if they were still here in spring. He looked at the rings of small trees, some of them barely taller than he was, and then he looked at the wide sky to the north, where the quality of light was already beginning its seasonal concession to the dark. "Mama." His voice was careful, the careful voice of a child who has learned that some questions need to be framed with precision. "Are the trees afraid?" She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said. "They're working." He thought about this. Then he went back inside, apparently satisfied, and she remained alone with the 94 small trees in the pewter sky and the knowledge that the ground would be fully frozen within 3 weeks, and the first serious storm of the winter would come when it came, and that everything she had built, every hour of labor, every calculation, every principle her father had pressed into her on a Vermont hillside 22 years ago, would be tested by something that did not know or care what she understood about it. That night, she woke at 2 in the morning. The cabin was dark except for the faint orange seam at the base of the stove door, and the sound that had woken her was a change in the wind. Not louder, different. The direction had shifted, coming now from the northwest, from the exact quarter that held her incomplete corner, and it carried in it a cold so complete and structural, it felt less like weather and more like a statement of intent. She rose and put on her coat and her boots, and went to the cabin door and opened it a crack and looked out. The night was clear and moonlit, and she could see the rings of small trees standing in the silver light, and they were trembling in the wind. Not breaking. Bending and returning, the way living things move under pressure, which is differently from the way dead things move. She stood and watched them for a long time. The wind moved through the outer ring with a sound like rushing water, and when it reached the inner ring, the sound changed lower, more complex, broken into something less singular and more various. She did not know whether this meant what she needed it to mean. She only knew that she had placed her children's lives on the same shelf as her father's lesson, and the memory of a still afternoon in a Vermont forest, and that the wind was coming, and that the ground would tell its truth when the ground was ready. She went back to bed. She did not sleep again before morning. The story that traveled from claim to claim across that part of Wyoming Territory in November of 1886 did not travel the way Margaret had told it. It traveled the way all stories travel through isolated communities, where information is scarce and judgment is plentiful, which is to say it changed shape with each telling until it resembled the original, the way a reflection in moving water resembles the thing it reflects. By the time it reached the trading post at Kellerman's Crossing, 12 miles east, the widow Hale had reportedly planted trees in a circle around her cabin because she believed it would keep evil spirits from finding her door in the dark. The man who told this version found it both amusing and sad, the way men find things amusing and sad when they do not have to live with the consequences of being wrong about them. What reached Margaret herself was a simpler and more direct version of the same dismissal. Daniel came home from Kellerman's Crossing on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-November, where she had sent him with 2 pennies for a paper of needles and her written list for the dry goods she needed before the roads became impassable. And he was quiet the whole walk back in a way that was different from his usual quiet. His usual quiet was thoughtful, internally occupied, the quiet of a child processing the world at his own pace. This quiet was the kind that forms around something heard that the hearer does not know how to put down. She waited until he had his supper, and Lily was occupied with the corn-husk doll she carried everywhere. And then she sat across from him at the table and looked at him in the particular way that had always meant she was ready to hear whatever it was. Daniel's jaw tightened the way his father's had when George was deciding whether something needed to be said. Mr. Pruitt at the store said you don't have a husband to straighten you out, so you do crazy things. He delivered it flatly without editorializing, which was its own form of courage. He said it to Mr. Aldrich, and they laughed. Margaret sat with that for a moment. The stove made its quiet ticking sound as the metal expanded with the heat, and outside the wind moved through the outer ring of trees with the low rushing sound she had begun to catalog, to listen to the way a physician listens to a chest for information about what was happening inside. The sound tonight told her the wind was coming from the northwest again, which it had done with increasing frequency through November, as if it were rehearsing. "Mr. Pruitt sells needles and flowers," she said finally. "He's very good at it." She stood and began clearing the table, and Daniel after a moment started to help, and neither of them said anything more about it. But the thing had been said, and it sat in the room with them for the rest of the evening, the way unwelcome things do, taking up space that belongs to something better. What she did not tell Daniel, because he was 7, and already carrying more than a 7-year-old should carry, was that Pruitt's laughter was the least of what she was managing. 3 days before Daniel's trip to the trading post, Silas Mercer had come back. Not with Ruth this time. Alone on horseback on a gray Wednesday morning, when the sky had the dense low quality of a ceiling rather than a sky, and the temperature had dropped overnight to something that made the air itself feel structural. He had not dismounted. He sat on his horse at the edge of her property and looked at the completed rings of saplings, which had by then settled into their positions with slightly more authority than they had shown in October, their roots beginning to find what purchase they could in Wyoming's resistant soil. He looked at them for a while, and then he looked at Margaret, who was splitting wood near the lean-to and had stopped when she heard him coming. "I'll give you fair market price for the claim." His voice was different from the October version, stripped of the paternal instruction, more businesslike and therefore more honest. "The land is worth more to me as a grazing expansion than it is to you as a homestead you cannot realistically manage through the winter. I am not trying to cheat you. I am trying to offer you a sensible way out before circumstances make the decision for you." Margaret set the maul head down on the splitting block and rested both hands on the handle. The cold was sharp enough that she could feel it through her gloves, a clean, penetrating cold that had teeth in it. She looked at Silas Mercer on his horse, and she thought about what it meant that he had come alone this time, without Ruth's performance of sympathy, without the social scaffolding of neighborly concern. Alone and direct meant he was no longer making a point. He was making a transaction. "The claim is not for sale." Each word separate and unambiguous, the way you speak to someone who you want to be certain has heard you precisely. "Not at fair market price, and not at any other price. Not this winter, and not in the spring." Silas shifted in the saddle. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite anger and not quite respect, and occupied the complicated territory between them. "When the storm comes," he said, and he said it without the lecturing quality of October, almost quietly, "and you find yourself unable to open that door, you send Daniel on the horse to my place. Don't wait too long. In a bad enough storm, the horse won't make it either." Then he turned and rode back the way he had come, and Margaret stood holding the maul handle and watching him go. And what she felt in the aftermath of that exchange was not the clean resolution of a confrontation successfully navigated. It was something more complicated, the recognition that Silas Mercer, underneath the certainty and the presumption and the transactional calculus of the offer he had just made, was also afraid of what Wyoming winter could do to a woman and 2 small children alone on an exposed claim. His fear was not her problem to solve. But it was real, and she noted it and filed it in the same place she filed everything that might eventually be useful. She went back to splitting wood. She split wood until her arms stopped being reliable, and then she stacked what she had cut and went inside. The days shortened toward December, with what felt like acceleration, as if the year were running out of something and moving faster to compensate. Margaret worked through each of them with the systematic attention of someone who understands that preparation is a form of argument. Every cord of wood stacked was a counterposition to Silas Mercer's offer. Every bucket of water drawn and stored was a rebuttal to Mr. Pruitt's laughter. She checked the saplings each morning, walking the rings, and looking at each tree the way a commander looks at troops for a campaign for signs of failure or fortitude for anything that had changed in the night. The 2 replacement trees in the northwest corner were the ones she checked last and longest each morning, not by repeating the same gestures of worry, but by reading them differently as the weeks advanced, the way a doctor reads the same patient across successive visits, measuring change rather than confirming fear. Through November, they held their needle color, and their soil showed no signs of significant heave during the first hard freezes. By the end of the month, she had graduated from dread to cautious assessment. They were not thriving. But they were not failing either, and in Wyoming in November, that distinction was the only one that mattered. The phenomenon she had first noticed during the moonlit night in early November had developed into something she could track with more precision as the weeks passed. When the wind came from the northwest, which was its preferred direction in this part of the territory, as winter tightened its hold, she could stand just inside the outer ring of trees and hear the change in its character as it moved through the branches. The sound above the ring was the raw, unmediated sound of Wyoming wind in winter, a long, sustained note with an edge in it. The sound within the ring was lower, more various the way a river sounds when it moves from open water into a section broken by stones. She could feel the reduction in velocity on her face, not dramatic, not the complete cessation she remembered from Vermont, because the trees were still young and their branching was still thin but present, measurable, real. She did not tell this to anyone except Vera Whitman, who came by on the third Saturday of November with another covered dish in the calm, attentive manner of someone keeping a watch they have not announced. Margaret brought her to stand inside the outer ring and let the wind speak for itself, and Vera stood there for a long time with her eyes closed and her face turned toward the northwest, receiving the information through her skin rather than her reasoning. And when she opened her eyes, she said nothing immediately, but nodded once in the slow, definitive way that Margaret had come to understand as Vera's version of conviction. "Edward needs to see this," Vera said, "in the spring, when you can show him the result." There was something in the phrasing, "when you can show him the result," that contained an assumption of survival that was itself a form of gift. The strange, luminous gray light that Margaret associated with serious incoming weather arrived on a Monday in the second week of December, settling over the territory like a lid being lowered onto something. The sun became a pale, diffuse disk behind a high, thin overcast, giving no warmth and casting no shadows, and the wind dropped away completely sometime before noon, leaving behind a silence that was nothing like peace. Margaret had felt this particular silence once before in the winter of 1884, the week before a storm that had killed 17 head of Silas Mercer's cattle and kept the territory buried for 9 days. She had been inside that storm with George, who had burned through their wood supply at a rate that had frightened her, and who had pronounced it the worst he had ever seen with the satisfied authority of a man who considers surviving something proof that he managed it correctly. She made her preparations with a steadiness that she recognized as the practical cousin of fear. She brought in the last of the split wood and stacked it along the interior north wall floor to ceiling, enough for 10 days if she was careful, 12 if the storm broke early. She filled every container in the cabin with water from the well, every pot, every bucket, every crock, even the copper wash basin she normally kept under the bed, because ice could be melted. But melting ice took heat, and heat took wood, and wood was finite. She went to the lean-to and gave the milk cow extra hay and checked the bar on the door twice and looked at the animal's eyes for the specific quality of unease that livestock showed before serious weather. The cow's eyes were dark and still not calm, but deeply quiet, the stillness of a creature that has received information through channels unavailable to human senses. She checked the northwest corner trees one last time in the afternoon when the light was already failing. They stood in the still air, their branches hanging motionless in the unnatural calm, and she put her hand on the nearer one and felt through her glove the particular flexibility of a living branch, not rigid but responsive. The wood holding tension the way a drawn bow holds tension ready to give without breaking. She had done everything she could do. The principle was either sound or it wasn't. The trees were either strong enough or they weren't. The gap in the northwest corner was either small enough to be self-correcting or it wasn't. She had never in her life found it easy to live in the space between a decision made and its consequence revealed. George had been able to do it with a naturalness she envied, the way some people can set something down and simply leave it where they put it. She carried every unresolved thing with her, turning it, examining it, looking for what she might have missed or misjudged. Standing beside the northwest trees in the failing light of that Monday afternoon, she turned the whole construction one more time in her mind, and she found the same answer she had found every other time. She had been as precise as her knowledge allowed and as careful as her strength permitted. And what happened next was no longer in her hands. She went inside and barred the door. The storm announced itself just after dark, with a sound she felt before she heard a low concussive pressure change that made the cabin's walls flex almost imperceptibly, as if the building had taken a breath. Then the wind arrived, and it did not arrive gradually. It arrived with the completeness of something that had been building momentum for 1,000 miles of open country and had finally reached an obstacle worth its full attention. The single glass pane in the west window registered the impact as a sharp, fine rattle, and the sound outside shifted from the low moans she had been cataloging for weeks to something fuller and less musical, a sustained roar with a physical weight behind it. Margaret lit the lantern and set it on the table. The warm yellow light it threw made the room smaller and more contained, which was precisely what she needed it to do. She put the kettle on the stove and began the stew-salted beef and potatoes and the last of the dried onion, the smell of it filling the cabin with a definiteness that was itself a form of resistance to the chaos assembling outside. Daniel sat at the table and watched her with the careful attention of a child who is not going to ask the question he is most afraid to ask, and Lily pressed herself against Margaret's leg with both arms, until Margaret reached down and detached her gently and set her on the stool nearest the stove where she could feel the heat. The roar outside climbed in stages through the first hours of the storm, each increment arriving like a statement being revised upward. Margaret listened to it the way she had learned to listen to the trees for information beneath the noise. The high, sharp whistle that the northwest corner of the roofline usually produced in heavy weather was present but different, arriving in intermittent pulses rather than the sustained shriek she associated with direct wind impact. The deep percussive thudding against the north wall, which in previous winters had accompanied the feeling that the wall itself was being personally addressed, was muffled, not absent. Muffled as though the force arriving at the wall had traveled through something between its origin and its destination and had lost some portion of itself in the passage. She did not tell herself this was proof. She did not allow herself the relief of certainty prematurely. She noted it the way her father had taught her to note things, is data that belonged to a pattern that would reveal itself completely only when complete. She went to the window and breathed on the frost to clear a small patch and looked out into the storm, and she could see nothing but white movement, horizontal and total, the world reduced to a single undifferentiated force. Whatever was happening to her trees was happening beyond the reach of observation. She was in the period of faith now which her father had also taught her about, though he had called it by a different name. He had called it standing behind your work. She did not sleep well that first night. She lay in the dark listening to the storm with the focused attention of someone trying to read a language she mostly but not entirely understood, parsing the sounds for what they meant about what was happening in the rings of trees outside. At some point before dawn, she heard something that stopped her breath, a sharp crack, distinct and final. Even through the storm's surrounding noise, the sound of something breaking under load. She lay very still for a long moment afterward, calculating. A branch failing under snow weight, a fence post, the old wagon wheel she had left propped against the east side of the cabin all autumn and had not found time to move. Any of those things, possibly none of those things. She did not get up to check. She could not get up to check. That was the particular cruelty of this moment. She had built a system she could not observe while it was being tested, and she had to lie in the dark with the sound of a crack she could not identify and let the storm continue without knowing what it had taken. She was still awake when the light changed the darkness outside the window, moving from absolute black to the dark gray that preceded a Wyoming winter dawn, though dawn in a blizzard was more a technical condition than an observable event. She rose and stoked the fire and started the children's oatmeal and did not go to the window because looking out would tell her nothing, and the act of looking would cost her something she needed to conserve. 12 miles north in a storm that was the same storm and yet by the evidence of what it produced, a more complete and unimpeded version of itself. Silas Mercer was in the middle of discovering the limits of certainty. The roof of his barn, which he had reinforced in October, with additional cross-bracing as a concession to the previous year's damage, had developed a sound in the second hour of the storm that he recognized with a cold that had nothing to do with weather. He and his son had spent 4 hours in the howling dark, reinforcing the bracing from the inside, working by lantern light, with the animals pressing against them, and the barn walls flexing in ways that barns were not designed to flex. They had held it, But in the main cabin, a section of daubing between two of the north wall logs had been driven out by the wind's pressure. And the gap it left admitted a cold so focused and complete that Ruth had moved the children to the south corner of the cabin and stacked everything movable against the north wall as insulation, while Silas was still in the barn. He had packed the gap with rags and strips of blanket, and he had sat in the cabin that night and listened to the wind with an attention he had never previously brought to listening, because there had never previously been anything in the wind's behavior that he had not already categorized and understood. What he discovered in those hours was something he would not have articulated easily, because it required acknowledging that the categories he had built over 15 years of Wyoming winters were not as comprehensive as he had believed. The wind was not, it turned out, simply a force that pushed. It was a force that found things. It found gaps and edges and weak points with a methodical persistence that felt in the dark hours of a serious storm almost intentional. He thought, and it was not a comfortable thought, about the widow Hale's cabin in its ring of small trees 10 miles to the south. The second day of the storm was indistinguishable from the first except in the children's tolerance for confinement, which decreased with the systematic reliability of a clock running down. Lily, who was 4 and had no mechanism for understanding why the world had become noise and stillness in equal and alternating measure, cycled between contentment and inconsolable crying with a frequency that would have exhausted Margaret under ordinary circumstances, and which she managed now by a combination of songs she half remembered from her own childhood and a focused refusal to allow her own state of mind to transmit itself to her daughter. Daniel had found a way to occupy himself that moved Margaret in a way she did not show him. He had taken the piece of scrap paper on which she had drawn the original schematic of the tree rings, and he was copying it carefully onto a fresh piece of paper with the stub of pencil he used for his schoolwork, reproducing the concentric circles and the spacing marks and the compass direction indicators in the earnest, slightly unsteady hand of a 7-year-old engaged in an act of devotion. She told stories. She told them the story of the balsam stand on the Vermont hillside, not as a lesson, but as an adventure. The way her father had always understood that the best way to teach a child something important was to make it something they wanted to inhabit, rather than something they were required to absorb. She described the bite of the open hillside wind and the moment of stepping behind the wall of green, and the sudden silence and the snow on the forest floor. And Lily, who had stopped crying, listened with her whole body the way small children listen to stories they have decided are true. On the third day, the wind reached what Margaret understood without being able to verify it to be its peak. The sound it made was no longer something that could be called weather. It was a condition the way darkness is a condition or grief is a condition, a total environment that preceded and would presumably outlast her awareness of it. The cabin shook in a register she felt in her back teeth. The stovepipe hummed a single continuous note. The rag she had stuffed under the door moved with the breathing of the wind's pressure changes, contracting and expanding in small rhythmic pulses that she watched from across the room with a focused, almost meditative attention. And underneath all of it, beneath the roar and the shaking and the bone-deep vibration of a storm at its full unmediated force, she listened for the sounds that were absent. The high, sustained shriek of direct wind impact on the roofline present, but intermittent arriving in bursts, rather than the constant scream of a cabin fully exposed. The sound of snow hissing against the west window audible, but with a quality she had not encountered before in Wyoming winters, softer as though the crystals arriving at the glass had already spent some portion of their velocity before reaching it. She filed each of these observations in the same careful place and did not yet allow herself to draw conclusions from them. On the morning of the fourth day, she woke before light to a sound she had been waiting for without letting herself consciously anticipate it. Silence. Not a reduction in the storm's noise or a shift in its character. Silence full and abrupt, the silence of an engine that has stopped, total and slightly shocking in its completeness after 72 hours of uninterrupted roar. She lay in it for a moment, disoriented by its density. Then she was out of bed with her coat and boots before she had fully decided to move. Daniel stirred in his bunk. She held up a hand that meant stay and crossed to the door in 3 steps and put her hand on the bar. The bar was cold through her glove. She lifted it from its brackets and set it against the wall and put both palms flat on the door and pushed. The door opened, easily, completely, the leather hinges silent, no resistance from accumulated snow. Weight, no compression of drifted mass against the outside face. It swung open to the morning in a pale winter light that was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She stepped across the threshold and stopped. The space inside the tree rings was not what she had calculated. It was better. It was so much better than what she had calculated that she stood in it for a long time without moving, because moving seemed likely to disturb something. The ground around the cabin was covered in perhaps 4 inches of fine, undisturbed powder, the kind of snow that falls in still air, which meant the air in this space had been still enough for long enough to allow snowfall rather than snow transport. And beyond the inner ring of trees at the line of the outer ring, the storm had built its wall. It rose in a smooth, sculpted curve, wind-shaped and architecturally precise from the ground, to a height that cleared the cabin's roof peak by several feet. The trees of the outer ring were half submerged in it, their upper halves emerging from the snow like the masts of ships in a white harbor. Still green, still intact, their branches bent under load but not broken. The storm had used them as its framework and had built around them something Margaret could not have constructed with a team of men and a season's worth of labor, a continuous insulating rampart dense and massive that sealed off the cabin's exposure to the north with a completeness no board fence or sod wall could have matched. She walked forward through the powder. Her boots sank 4 inches and stopped. She moved through the space between the tree rings, which was calm and warmer than the open air, in a way she could feel on the exposed skin of her face, and she went directly to the northwest corner, to the gap, to the 2 replacement trees she had watched with such sustained, carefully managed anxiety for 6 weeks. The gap had closed itself, not by the trees growing, but by the wind. The drift had used the asymmetry of the spacing to build a larger mass at that corner than elsewhere, packing the gap with a volume of snow that exceeded what had accumulated in the sections where the spacing was correct, as though the wind had found the weakness and compensated for it with the only currency it possessed. The principle had worked at the point of its greatest vulnerability, and the principle had held. And she stood in the northwest corner in the cold morning air and put her gloved hand on the snow mass that filled the gap and felt it solid and dense and real against her palm. Her father's voice came to her not as a memory, but as a presence, the specific quality of a voice that has said something once and does not need to say it again. Nature doesn't fight nature, Elspeth. It uses it. She had carried his words across 22 years and 2,000 miles of American distance, and she had planted them in Wyoming ground, and the ground had received them, and they had held. She was still standing in the northwest corner when she heard the cabin door open behind her. Daniel came out in his coat and boots, Lily bundled against his side with one arm, in the automatic protective gesture he had developed since April, and they both stopped at the threshold and looked at what the storm had made. Daniel's face did the thing that faces do when reality exceeds the model the mind has been building of it, a rapid series of adjustments, each one revising upward until the model and the reality found each other somewhere neither had anticipated. He looked at the snow wall and the trees and the calm protected space and the 4 inches of undisturbed powder, and then he looked at his mother standing in the northwest corner, with her hand on the drift, and his voice when it came was the voice of someone much older than 7, stripped of everything except the essential. It worked exactly like you said. She did not answer him immediately. She was looking at the outer ring of trees, running her eyes along the line of green tips emerging from the white counting. 94 trees, she counted them twice. All present, none broken, none torn from the ground, none flattened. Bent, many of them weighted with the snow that had used them as its architecture, but alive and rooted and doing what living things do under load, which is yield without surrendering. The storm had been the adversary she had prepared for in the architects she had hired, and the labor she had directed all at once. It had done the work she needed it to do precisely because she had understood what it wanted to do and had arranged the conditions for those 2 things to be the same thing. The insight her father had given her on a cold Vermont hillside was not a trick or a technique or a piece of regional knowledge that applied only to balsam forests in New England. It was a principle, and principles did not care about geography. She looked toward the north, where Vera Whitman's claim lay 2 miles distant under the same white blanket that covered everything she could see in every direction. She thought about Vera's son Edward and his cabin on the exposed northern rise and the 3 days Vera had spent not knowing. She thought about what she was going to say to Vera when travel was possible again, and the thought had a shape and weight that felt like purpose, which was a thing she had not felt with such clarity since before April. She went inside and put on the coffee. The silence after the storm lasted 2 full days. Not the silence of calm, but the silence of a territory that has been rearranged, every familiar sound muffled under a weight of snow that had redrawn the landscape into something that resembled the original, only in its general dimensions. The track that connected the homesteads across that part of Wyoming was gone, not blocked but erased, absorbed into a continuous white surface that offered no distinction between road and field, between the known path and the open ground that fell away from it on either side. The sky after the storm was the particular blue that follows serious weather in the high plains, a blue so clean and complete it looked manufactured, and the sun in it threw shadows that were almost purple across the sculpted drifts. Margaret spent those 2 days in a state of productive stillness that was entirely different from the stillness of waiting. The waiting was over. What replaced it was the quiet, methodical work of assessment. The cow in the lean-to examined and found intact her water trough, frozen but breakable, her hay supply sufficient for another week. The wood stack against the north wall measured against the remaining cold and found adequate with careful management. The water stores cataloged and rationed. She moved through these tasks with the unhurried efficiency of someone whose mind has been freed from a burden it had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its weight. Both northwest corner trees had held through the storm. Their roots had found enough of a grip in the cold clay to keep them anchored through what the territory's old-timers, she would later learn, were already calling the worst December storm since 1880. She had not known it was going to be that storm. She had only prepared for a bad one, and the principle it turned out scaled with the severity of the event it was asked to manage. On the morning of the third day after the storm, she heard a horse. The sound carried far in the post-storm silence, a muffled rhythmic effort that told her the animal was working hard through deep snow before she could see it, and she went to the door and opened it and watched Silas Mercer come around the massive drift that had blocked the main track, his horse sinking to its belly with each step and recovering with the labored patience of a good animal being asked to do something difficult. Silas sat the horse with his usual solidity, his coat dark against the white, his breath and the horse's breath making parallel clouds in the cold morning air, and she watched him come without any particular feeling about it, except a clear and quiet readiness for whatever the encounter was going to require. He rounded the last obstruction in the track, and the Hale homestead came into his full view, and he stopped the horse. She had wondered in the 2 days of post-storm stillness what it would look like from the outside. From inside the tree rings, the experience had been of calm and protection, and the profound satisfaction of a system that had performed beyond its own specifications. From outside, she now saw through Silas Mercer's arrested posture and his horse's motionless confusion, it looked like something that should not have been possible. The great sculpted wall of snow, smooth and continuous and rising well above the cabin's roofline, wrapped around the homestead in a curve that was architecturally elegant in the way that things shaped entirely by natural forces sometimes achieve an elegance that deliberate construction cannot replicate. And inside it, visible through the gap where the track approached the cabin door, was the protected space with its few inches of settled powder and the smoke rising from the chimney in a lazy, unhurried column that meant warmth and function and survival. He sat on his horse for a long time. Margaret did not call out to him or gesture or do anything to assist his comprehension of what he was looking at. She stood in her doorway and let the scene make its own argument, which it was entirely capable of doing without her help. Lily appeared at Margaret's hip, pressing her face against the doorframe to see what her mother was looking at. Then Daniel came up behind them both, and the three of them stood in the doorway of the cabin that the storm had tried to bury, and had instead fortified, watching Silas Mercer discover that the world contained a principle he had not known about. He dismounted. His horse sank immediately past its knees in the snow of the open track, and he waded the last distance to the protected space around the cabin with the effortful, high-stepping gait of someone crossing difficult terrain, and then he stepped inside the outer ring and stopped again. The difference in the air was immediately perceptible, even to someone who had not been measuring it for weeks. The wind that moved across the top of the drift and continued its journey south was audible as a faint high note overhead, but at ground level the air was still, and the temperature differential was enough to feel on the face after the exposure of the open track. Silas felt it. She could see him feel it, the slight change in his expression that meant his body had received information his mind was still processing. He walked toward her, his eyes moving from the snow wall to the trees embedded in it, to the protected ground around the cabin, and back assembling and reassembling the geometry of what he was seeing. He stopped a few feet from the door. He looked at the wall and the trees and the still air and the smoke and the children in the doorway, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on Silas Mercer before, which was the expression of a man who has run out of categories. She went inside and poured 2 mugs of coffee from the pot she had made an hour earlier, in the calm certainty of knowing this visit was coming, because someone was always going to come to check on the widow, and she had wanted to be ready. She brought both mugs out and handed him one, and he took it without speaking, his hands wrapping around the warmth of it, and they stood together in the protected space that the storm had built around her cabin and drank their coffee in the cold, bright morning. He was quiet for a long time. She had always thought that Silas Mercer's silences were the silences of a man composing his next pronouncement. But this silence was different in kind. It was the silence of someone who has had something taken from them and is not yet sure what to put in its place. The certainty she had watched him carry through every interaction they had ever had was not present in him this morning. In its absence, he looked older and more human, and she found that she did not feel the satisfaction she might have anticipated at his disorientation. His voice, when it finally came, was lower than his usual register, rougher, as if the words had been waiting in a part of him that was not accustomed to being used. "You made the storm build you a fortress." He said it not as an acknowledgement of her cleverness, but as a statement of a fact he was still coming to terms with, the way people state facts that have reorganized something fundamental. "I told you it would bury you, and it built you a fortress instead." Margaret looked at the wall of snow and the trees inside it and thought about the right response to a man who has just said something true at the cost of something he valued. "The storm didn't care what either of us thought it would do," she said. "It only did what moving air does when it meets the right resistance." He took a long drink of his coffee. The steam rose from the mug and disappeared. Somewhere above the drift, the wind made its faint, continuous note, the sound of a force that had spent itself on her trees and moved on to find other obstacles, other arguments, other claims to test. Silas looked at the green tops of the outer ring trees emerging from the white, and something in his expression shifted toward a question he was not quite able to form. She formed it for him because she had been her father's daughter long enough to know that the most important moment in the transmission of understanding is the moment when someone stops defending their previous position and starts actually asking. "In the spring," she said, "when the snow pulls back and you can see how the roots held come back, and I'll show you everything. The spacing, the soil preparation, the way the rings work together. Whatever you need to know." He nodded. It was the nod of a man who has not yet decided how much pride the situation requires him to manage, but who has decided that whatever the cost, the information is worth it. He finished his coffee and handed the mug back and waded out through the deep snow to his horse, and she watched him go with the same steadiness with which she had watched him arrive, and when he was gone, she went back inside to where her children were waiting. What happened in the weeks that followed was not a single event, but an accumulation, the way weather accumulates one condition, building on the preceding one until the aggregate is different in kind from any of its individual components. The story of the Hale homestead traveled through the territory the way the earlier version had traveled through the same channels of wagon track conversation and trading post exchange and neighbor-to-neighbor telling, but it traveled now in a different direction. The woman who planted trees in a circle because grief had disordered her judgment became the woman whose trees had built her a snow fortress in the worst December storm since 1880. The transformation in the telling was neither gradual nor complete. There were still people in that part of Wyoming who would maintain for years afterward that there must have been some other explanation, some feature of the terrain, or some exceptional quality of that particular storm that accounted for the result. People who had built their identity around understanding the land did not easily accommodate evidence that the land contained principles they had not known about. But the people who came to see it in January, when travel became possible again, and the drift was still largely intact, and the contrast between the protected space inside the rings and the open devastation of the surrounding landscape was still legible. Those people came back to their own claims, carrying something that had not been there before. It did not always translate immediately into action. Understanding a principle and knowing what to do with it are different operations, and the gap between them is where most knowledge goes to wait indefinitely. What Margaret Hale had done in addition to building the system was something she had not planned and could not have planned. She had made the principle visible in a form that could be walked through and felt and measured with a cold hand pressed against the snowdrift, and that kind of evidence does not need an advocate. Vera Whitman arrived on the fourth day after Silas's visit, having walked 2 miles through snow that had consolidated enough in the cold to support her weight with careful placement. She came around the drift and into the protected space and stood in it with the same focused assessment she had brought to every observation Margaret had ever watched her make, and she was quiet for a long time, in the particular way of someone taking inventory. Then she said, "I'm going to tell Edward to come in the spring and you're going to show him everything." It was not a request. It had the quality of a plan that had been forming for some time and had now reached the point of announcement. "And I'm going to tell every woman in this territory who has a cabin on an exposed claim that there is a woman on Cottonwood Creek who figured out how to make Wyoming winters do the work for her instead of against her." Margaret looked at Vera and thought about what it meant to have a witness. Not an audience, not an admirer, not someone who would use the story to reflect credit on their own judgment by association. A witness was someone who had been present for the thing itself, who had watched it from the beginning without having a stake in the outcome, and whose account of it would carry the weight of disinterest. Vera Whitman was the most valuable person in Wyoming Territory for Margaret's purposes, and Margaret had not calculated that when she had explained the principle to her in October. She had explained it because Vera was listening, and that had turned out to be enough. "I'll show everyone who wants to know," Margaret said. "There's no version of this that benefits from being kept private." Vera nodded, and they went inside, and Margaret made tea, and they talked for 2 hours about practical matters, which species of tree worked best for the inner ring, which for the outer. What soil preparation was necessary in Wyoming's specific clay-dominant composition. What spacing adjustments might be needed for claims with different prevailing wind directions. How to identify suitable saplings at the creek bank, and how to transport them without destroying the root mass that made the difference between a tree that took and a tree that failed. Vera listened and asked precise questions and did not write anything down because she did not need to, her memory for practical information being the kind that had been sharpened by years of needing it in conditions where forgetting had consequences. When Vera left, she carried the knowledge in the same way Margaret had carried it for 22 years. Not as information separate from herself, but as something integrated. Something that had changed the way she understood the landscape she had been looking at for decades. Margaret watched her walk back down the track toward her own claim and felt for the first time since George's death that what she was doing had a dimension that extended beyond her own survival. Edward Whitman came in March when the snow had pulled back enough to make the tree roots visible and the structure of the planting legible to someone who needed to understand it technically. He was a large man, taciturn in the way of his mother, but without Vera's warmth beneath the quiet, and he arrived with the watchful reserve of someone who has been told something extraordinary and is still deciding whether to believe it. He walked the rings of trees with Margaret for 2 hours, crouching beside each one to look at the root collar pressing the soil, asking questions about depth and angle and the specific way the burlap wrapping had been applied. He wanted to understand the mechanism, not the miracle, which was exactly the right instinct, and told her something important about what kind of man he was beneath the reserve. At the northwest corner, where the 2 replacement trees stood in the soil that had received the gap-filling drift all winter and was now the richest, most worked earth in the entire planting, he crouched for a long time looking at both trees. They had come through the winter in better condition than several of the original plantings, their roots having been forced by the cold into a deeper, more aggressive search for purchase. The gap that had worried Margaret for 6 weeks had produced by accident, or by the logic of adversity, the strongest section of the inner ring. "My mother said you told her a tired wind drops its load," Edward said, his voice carrying the careful quality of someone quoting something they have been thinking about. "I've been working this land for 8 years and I never thought about wind getting tired." Margaret looked at the northwest trees and thought about her father's hands on a balsam branch in Vermont, and the way some knowledge arrives not as a conclusion, but as a sensation, something felt before it is understood. Wind isn't trying to do anything to you personally, she said. It's just moving from one place to another and dropping what it can't carry anymore. The question is whether you have given it a reason to drop its load where you need it. Edward was quiet for a moment. Then he asked how many trees he would need for a cabin with similar exposure and similar dimensions. And they did the calculation together standing in the mud of early spring, and Margaret gave him the number and the spacing and the soil formula and the creek bank locations where the best saplings were found, and she gave it all without reservation because the knowledge was not diminished by being shared, which was the thing her father had understood about forests that most people who thought about timber did not. He came back in September of that same year with his son, a boy of perhaps 12, and they spent 3 days at Cottonwood Creek with Margaret's guidance harvesting saplings and transporting them to his claim on the exposed northern rise. She rode with them on the first day to show them what to look for and how to ball the roots and how to read the density of the young stand for the specific trees that would transplant most successfully. On the second day, she left them to continue alone because the knowledge had transferred, and what it needed now was practice rather than supervision. On the third day, they came back to tell her they had planted 67 trees and that the outer ring was complete and the inner ring would be finished before the ground froze. She told them to water each one by hand for as long as the well held open. The conversation at Kellerman's Crossing changed. This was not a sudden transformation with a clear before and after. It was the kind of change that becomes visible only in retrospect when you look back and realize that at some point the people who had been certain of one thing became people who were uncertain of a different thing instead. Mr. Pruitt still held his opinions, but he held them with less authority now, because authority in isolated communities derives partly from having been right, and the record on the widow Hale was no longer running in his favor. The men who had laughed when Daniel was in the store buying needles found other things to laugh about, which is the natural behavior of people who are not ready to acknowledge that their laughter was premature. What replaced the laughter gradually and without announcement was questions. People came to Margaret directly, which was a different kind of recognition than being talked about, because coming directly required a person to set aside the comfortable distance of commentary and acknowledge that the person they were approaching had something they needed. A homesteader named Brooks from the south quarter of the territory came in late April asking about tree species. A woman named Agnes Fowler, whose husband had been injured in a cattle accident and who was managing her claim alone through the spring while he recovered, came in May and stayed for an afternoon and went home with a sketch of the planting schema and a list of what to gather at the creek. Margaret gave each of them exactly what she gave Edward Whitman, everything she knew in as much detail as they could use without withholding anything for the purpose of maintaining an advantage that she had never sought in the first place. The shelter belt pattern, as people began to call it, started appearing around homesteads in the southern quarter of the territory that summer and the following autumn. Not everywhere, not uniformly, not always correctly executed, because the translation of a principle from one person's hands to another's always loses something in the passage, and some of the early attempts produced results that were more aspirational than functional. But the ones that were planted with care and understanding, the ones where the person planting had taken the time to grasp what the rings were actually doing rather than simply copying the visible form, those worked. They worked at the first winter and they worked at the second, and by the time they had worked at the third, the knowledge had the standing that knowledge acquires when it has been verified enough times to stop being debatable. Silas Mercer came in April of 1887 as he had promised. He came with 4 men, which was not what he had led her to expect, and was therefore, she understood immediately, a statement he had already told other people what he had seen, which meant he had already done more to spread the principle than his solitary visit would have accomplished, and he had done it at the cost of being the man who admitted he had been wrong in front of the same neighbors he had been wrong in front of. She had underestimated him. It was a pleasant discovery. They spent the morning at Cottonwood Creek and the afternoon at the homestead, and Silas was the most attentive student in the group, which did not surprise her. People who have committed fully to being right when they finally commit to being wrong tend to bring the same completeness to the new position. He asked about the soil mixing, about the specific depth of the planting holes, about whether the species she had chosen were available further north, where the drainage was different. He took no notes, but his questions were specific and sequential, building on each other, the questions of someone constructing a mental model rather than collecting isolated facts. At the northwest corner, she told him about the two replacement trees. She told him about the crack in the night during the second day of the storm and the 6 weeks of uncertainty about whether the gap would hold. And she told him what the drift had done to that corner, using it as the weakest point and packing it more densely there than anywhere else in the ring, as if compensating for the human error with its own unconscious correction. She watched his face as she told it, and she saw in it something she had not expected to see. There, a kind of wonder, genuine and unguarded, the expression of a man who has discovered that the world is more interesting than he had previously allowed it to be. All this time fighting the thing, he said, and the sentence did not need completion because the incompletion was the point. The reporter from a paper in Cheyenne arrived in late April of 1887 on a horse that looked like it had come a long way and had opinions about it. He was a young man with a notepad and the particular alertness of someone who has been told there is a story somewhere and is not yet sure exactly what it is. He had heard about the shelter belts from a cattleman in Cheyenne who had heard about them from someone in the Southern Territory, and the chain of telling had brought him 60 miles to a cabin surrounded by a ring of trees that were by April beginning to show the growth of their second season, the branches slightly thicker, the root systems deeper and more committed, the overall structure more convincing than it had been in the sparse vulnerability of October 1886. He asked Margaret to explain what she had done and why and how it worked, and she explained it to him the way she had explained it to everyone else, from the principle outward from Edmund Carr's balsam stand and the physics of fragmented air currents to the specific arrangement of rings and the role of the snowdrift as both product and amplifier of the system. She used the same words she had always used, the precise technical language her father had given her, because the principle did not benefit from being simplified, and the reporter was smart enough to follow it. He asked who had taught her. She told him about her father, about the Vermont forests, and the years of watching how trees and wind negotiated with each other, about the knowledge that had traveled with her from New England to Wyoming, inside her memory, waiting for the moment when it was the only tool she had left. He asked her name, which he wrote carefully in his notepad, and he asked whether she had formally studied forestry, which she had not, and whether there was literature on the subject she could point him to, which there was not in any form accessible to her, though she understood the principle was not unknown in academic circles. He thanked her and rode back toward Cheyenne, and 3 weeks later, a piece appeared in the paper under a headline she would not see for another month, when Vera Whitman brought the clipping to her door with the careful handling of something precious. The piece described the Hale shelter belt, using that name which Vera had told the reporter when he stopped at her claim on the way back and asked what people were calling it. It described the principle and the results in the storm of December 1886, and it described Edmund Carr of Vermont, whose name appeared in print for the first time in connection with knowledge he had carried alone for most of his working life and passed to a daughter who had carried it across a continent and planted it in hard soil on the other side of the country. It was not a long piece, and it was not a famous piece, and it did not change the world in any measurable, immediate sense. But it named a thing that had been unnamed, and naming is how the world agrees that something is real. Vera stood in Margaret's kitchen and watched her read the clipping and said nothing, which was the right thing, which Vera almost always knew. Margaret read it twice. She read her father's name twice. Edmund Carr, the man who had crouched beside a 10-year-old girl on a Vermont hillside and explained the democracy of wind, the way it would carry what it was strong enough to carry and surrender what it was not, the way a living screen could take that surrender and redirect it into something useful. He had died in 1878, 8 years before his daughter stood in a Wyoming doorway on a December morning and watched a storm finish the work he had started. He had not known the knowledge would travel this far, or take this form, or produce this particular morning. He had only known it was true, and he had given it to the person nearest to him in the way that people give things they believe are important. She folded the clipping carefully and put it in the cedar box where she kept the few things that mattered most: a letter from her mother, Daniel's first attempt at writing his own name, a dried sprig of balsam that she had carried from Vermont in the lining of her traveling bag and had never been able to fully account for keeping. The rings of trees grew through the summers and the winters with the accumulative patience of living things that are rooted in the right place. By the third year, they were substantially denser, the branches of adjacent trees in the inner ring beginning to interlace in the way that young evergreens grow toward each other in stands, and the visual effect from outside was less of a collection of individual trees and more of a continuous living structure, which was exactly what it was becoming. The snow management in the second and third winters was even more effective than the first because the trees were larger and their resistance to the wind was proportionally greater, and the drifts they produced were higher and more complete, and the protected space inside them was more defined and more stable. Daniel learned the name of every tree in both rings. He learned them the way his mother had learned the names of the trees on the Vermont hillsides, not as vocabulary to be memorized, but as the names of individuals he lived alongside, each with its particular growth habit and its specific contribution to the whole. He understood by the time he was 9 more about the interaction of wind and planet obstacles than most men in that part of the territory would understand in their lifetimes, and he understood it in the specific, unshowy way of someone who has learned something from the ground up rather than from a book down. Lily learned differently. She learned the way small children learn the things that matter to their mothers through proximity and attention and the unconscious absorption of what is treated as important. She could not have articulated the physics at 4 or 5 or 6, but she knew which trees were the ones her mother checked first in the morning, and which ones had come through the hard winter, and which ones had needed the most care, and that knowledge lived in her body in a way that was below the reach of forgetting. The cabin stood. It stood through the winter of 1887, and the winter of 1888, which was severe but not exceptional, and through the winter of 1889, which was exceptional but not in the direction of severity, and through all the subsequent winters that came and went across the Wyoming Territory as the century moved toward its close, and the territory moved towards statehood, and the landscape that had seemed immovable and permanent began to show in small ways and large that it was subject to the same forces of change that everything else was subject to. The homestead claims around it changed hands, some of them, as the people who had filed them ran out of the specific combination of luck and resilience that survival required, and new people came and filed new claims and began the process again. But the Hale homestead held, and the rings of trees around it grew, and the knowledge that Margaret had planted alongside them continued to move through the territory in the way that useful knowledge moves from hand to hand and voice to voice, accumulating small variations and adaptations as each person who received it applied it to their specific conditions and passed on what they learned. The shelter belt pattern that appeared around cabins across the Southern Territory was not identical to the original, because the original had been designed for specific conditions that did not exactly replicate anywhere else. But the principle behind all of them was the same principle that Edmund Carr had demonstrated on a Vermont hillside in January of 1864, which was that the way to manage a force you cannot stop is to understand what it is trying to do and arrange the conditions so that what it is trying to do is useful to you. Margaret was 41 years old when Daniel left the homestead to establish his own claim 15 miles to the east. He left in the spring with a wagon loaded with tools and supplies and 11 young spruce saplings, their roots balled in burlap, that he had harvested from the stand at Cottonwood Creek with the selectivity of someone who knew what he was looking for. He planted his first ring before he built his walls, which was not the order Margaret had followed, but was the order that made sense given what he knew, because he understood that the trees in the cabin were a single system and the trees needed the longer head start. Lily married at 22 and moved to a claim in the northern part of the territory in the high exposed country where the wind had a different character, longer and more sustained, and with less of the gusty variability of the southern plains. She wrote to Margaret asking for specifics about spacing adjustments for that kind of sustained wind, and Margaret wrote back with 3 pages of precise guidance and a hand-drawn schematic, and the instruction to plant the outer ring 20 feet out rather than 15 because a sustained wind needed more distance to begin its fragmentation before reaching the inner screen. Lily planted her rings that same autumn, and they worked, and she wrote again in the spring to say so, and Margaret kept that letter in the cedar box alongside the newspaper clipping and Daniel's first written name and the dried balsam sprig. The crack she had heard on the second night of the December storm was resolved in the spring thaw when the snow pulled back and the ground was accessible again. She found the remains of the old wagon wheel she had left propped against the east wall, broken cleanly at the hub, in a way consistent with the cold, contracting the iron and the wood separating under the load of accumulated snow. It had not been a tree. She had known it was probably not a tree in the rational part of her mind, but the rational part of her mind had not been the part that was awake at 2 in the morning, listening to a storm that was testing everything she had built. And so the discovery of the wheel gave her something she had not known she still needed, which was the final confirmation of a fear that she had already moved past but had not formally closed. She put the broken wheel in the woodpile where it burned well. On a morning in the spring of 1896, a woman arrived at the Hale homestead on horseback. Someone Margaret had not seen before traveling alone from a claim further north than Edward Whitman's, where the winters were harder and the terrain more exposed, and the need was correspondingly greater. She had heard about the shelter belts from someone who had heard about them from someone who had read something in a paper, and she had ridden 2 days to find the woman who had started them because she needed to understand the principle rather than just copy the form. She had figured out on the ride down that copying the form without understanding the principle would only get her so far, and she was right, and Margaret told her so. They walked the rings together, which by now were mature enough that their interlocked canopy created an actual windbreak sensation. Even in mild weather, the air inside noticeably quieter than the air outside, the temperature measurably different. The woman was observant, and her questions were the specific questions of someone who had already thought carefully about the problem and needed to fill in the gaps in her thinking rather than start from scratch. Margaret answered each one fully, and at the northwest corner, she told the story of the 2 replacement trees and the gap in the night of the crack, and the way the drift had compensated for the human error with its own impersonal corrective logic. The woman stood at the northwest corner for a long time looking at the 2 trees that were now a decade on among the most vigorous in the entire inner ring, their roots having had the benefit of the richest soil in the planting, the drift compacted, organically enriched earth that 10 winters of snow management had built in that corner above all others. The weak spot became the strongest part, the woman said, and it was not a question. Margaret looked at the northwest trees and thought about everything that statement contained: the gap and the fear and the crack in the night, and the drift that had filled what she could not fill herself, and the 2 trees that had grown more deeply rooted for having been planted last and given least. Things that survive hard conditions often do, she said. The woman nodded and took her leave, and Margaret stood alone in the northwest corner for a moment. The trees around her moved in the light morning wind, with the easy, confident motion of things that have been in their place long enough to trust it completely. She thought about her father, as she often did when she stood in this corner. She thought about the specific quality of his silence on that Vermont hillside, the way he had waited until she had seen both things, the drift outside and the powder inside, before he said anything, because he understood that the experience needed to precede the explanation, or the explanation would have nowhere to land. She had tried to give people that same sequence ever since the walk through the rings. First, the feeling of the air change on the face, the hand on the drift, and then the words. It worked the way he had taught her it worked. It worked because principle without experience is instruction, and principle with experience is understanding. And understanding is the only form of knowledge that travels reliably. When she thought about her father in this corner, she also thought about his hands, specifically the way they had moved on the balsam branch that January day, the same careful pressing motion she had repeated 10,000 times since on Wyoming soil. Edmund Carr had died in 1878, not knowing that the thing he had shown a 10-year-old girl on a Vermont hillside would eventually be named in a Cheyenne newspaper, would travel through a territory and then a state, and then a century would be practiced by people he had never met on ground he had never seen. He had only known it was true. Giving true things to the people nearest you turns out to be sufficient. The rest takes care of itself. The cabin stood for another 60 years after that spring morning in 1896, which meant it stood for 70 years in total from the day George Hale had set the last log in its north wall, and it outlasted the homestead era and the territorial period, and Wyoming statehood, and the arrival of the railroad and the automobile, and both world wars, and the specific form of American life that had required people to plant trees by hand in hard clay soil in the Wyoming autumn in order to still be alive in the spring. When it finally came down, it was not to weather or neglect, but to the deliberate decision of the family that owned it by then who needed the ground for something else, and who did not know, or perhaps did not fully know, what they were removing. The trees they left. They were too large by then to remove, practically their roots too deep and their trunks too substantial. and they formed a dense dark green circle on the open ground that any pilot flying that part of Wyoming at low altitude could identify as something intentional, something that had been placed there by someone who understood the relationship between living things and moving air. The circle was visible from a long way off, which was itself a kind of instruction. Here is what a principle looks like after enough time has passed, after it has grown into its own evidence. She had not fought the wind. She had listened to it the way her father had taught her to listen for what it wanted to do and where it wanted to go, and she had arranged her small portion of the world so that what it wanted and what she needed were the same direction. In doing so, she had kept her children warm through the worst winter anyone in that part of Wyoming could remember, and she had taught her neighbors something they had not known, and she had sent that knowledge moving through the territory. The way wind moves through a stand of trees, changed by the encounter quieter, carrying less than it arrived with, dropping its heaviest burden in the place where it was most needed. The wind in Wyoming does not stop. It has not stopped. It moves across the high plains with the same institutional indifference it brought to an October morning in 1886, flattening the grasses, carrying its load, looking for an obstacle worth its full attention. In the place where the Hale homestead stood, it meets a circle of trees that have been there long enough that the land has grown around them, rather than the other way around. And it does what moving air does when it meets a living screen assembled by someone who understood the difference between stopping a force and redirecting it. It rises, it loses its burden, it moves on. The snow falls inside the circle gently in still air, as if there were no storm at all.